Sorry, my face is not appearing on this iPad. I don't know why, but I'm here. So today, I was going to try to give the title of this presentation here. Kristin Bowen and Katie.
Herb, this is Katie. Do you
are
know
both
about using the new
today. And they're the co-leads for election work in Missouri for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. I can't, they're going to go over SCOTUS's recent decisions, the Surgeon General's declaration, and hope for positive impact on gun violence. So now I am switching to introducing them. As I said, we're welcoming 2 local volunteers today with the Missouri chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, a nonpartisan grassroots movement working to reduce all forms of gun violence throughout the United States. Moms Demand Action is part of Everytown for Gun Safety, along with Students Demand Action and Everytown Survivor Network, the largest gun violence organization in America, almost 10 million supporters, which is really exciting. Moms Demand Action supports evidence-based strategies to reduce gun violence in all its forms. It's a multifaceted organization that combats gun violence at the local, state, and national level and works to advance cultural shifts supporting gun safety. Kristin Bowen is a volunteer co-lead for the Missouri chapter's elections work across the state. And Katie Terry is the volunteer leader of Columbia Jefferson City local group of Moms Demand Action. Welcome here today. We're really excited that you can be here. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Alice. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, if that's okay with our host. Okay.
Yeah, go for it. It works great.
Okay. So, thanks, Alice. I am Kristin Bowen, and I'm a volunteer with the Missouri chapter of Moms Demand Action. As Alice mentioned, it's the largest network working to end gun violence in the country with nearly 10 million supporters nationwide. I got involved in this movement because I'm a mom to 2 boys who are actually, I should say, young men now. In the years after the Sandy Hook shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, because I came to understand that I couldn't look my kids in the eyes after high-profile mass shooting after high-profile mass shooting would occupy the headlines. And I just refused to let my kids think it was okay for our lawmakers and the adults around them to stand by and do nothing. So I started the Columbia Moms Demand Action Group in 2015 with some of my friends, including Katie Terry. Katie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for welcoming us. My story is very similar to Kristin's. I'm a mom of 2 children. And at one point, everyone in my family was on a college campus. I also have a vested interest in keeping our kids and our communities safe. Kristin, you want me to go ahead with the presentation?
Yeah, why don't we get started and give an overview of what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so before we get to both the U.S. Surgeon General and the U.S. Supreme Court, I just want to give you a little background about the impact of gun violence in this country and some of the things that Moms as an organization does to combat that. So just to start off, and this number has been climbing. I think when Kristin and I joined Moms Demand Action 7 or 8 years ago, it was under 100 people. But now today, 120 people are killed by gun violence every day in this country. And I would also tell you 2 things. One is that is an appalling number. The other is that most of those are considered mass shootings, so that we read in the news and hear on the TV about Uvalde or Highland Park, Sandy Hook, Buffalo, but really the most common situations are domestic violence situations where a partner will kill children and then their wife, girlfriend, or the other way around. So those make up the majority of the shootings. The other thing I would mention about 120 people being killed every day in this country is the ripple effect of gun violence. So for every 120 who are killed, easily 240 more are impacted. So that's friends, loved ones, survivors. That's our medical personnel who are working in ERs and in hospitals who are frontline people who deal with the gun violence. It's also somebody, a community. Nobody in Uvalde is the same after that. So neither is anyone in Sandy Hook. So those 120 people killed, but many, many more impacted, that there's a general sense it's coming for all of us at some point.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah,
Katie?
sure.
I want to pause and just say, last month we honored National Gun Violence Awareness Day with Wear Orange, and it's been on our minds. We know that many of us in our community have been directly impacted by gun violence, and we work in all of our meetings, in all of our events throughout the year to honor victims and survivors of gun violence. And so if anyone on the call today in this space identifies as a survivor, we want to thank you in particular for being here and honor that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so the other thing that happened in 2022 was that firearms became the leading cause of death for American children and teens. It overtook motor vehicle accidents. And that's just not okay. So that's another thing that we're working on. It's another statistic that we're not happy to share or be proud of, but just so you know, it's the #1 cause of death for children. And the Missouri, you will not be shocked to hear, has terrible, terrible rankings. I'll get to this in a little bit, but Moms Demand Action is part of Everytown for Gun Safety. Kristin mentioned that. And one of the things we do is a lot of research. There's a whole research team, there's a research website, and we don't promote any practices or advocate for any laws that we don't know don't work. And so one of the things that the Everytown research staff does is sort of look at states and see where we are. And Missouri is pretty terrible in the bottom 10 in general for every kind of terrible gun violence. And that includes, we have 2 cities, 2 large urban centers. So we do have a lot of gun deaths, homicides, and suicides. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But these are just some of the points that we can show where strong national leaders or strong state leaders with better gun laws. Illinois would be an example. J.B. Pritzker is very outspoken about gun safety. They have laws in Illinois which doesn't keep guns from moving into the state. Every state is only as strong as its weakest neighbor. But this just gives you an idea of where we are in terms of what good gun laws do and what bad things happen when we have weak laws. Kristin, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so we're talking with you all today in the wake of, mass shootings that happen so often that we maybe fail to track all of them. But here in Missouri, we were the site of a horrific shooting that grabbed national attention at the close of the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl parade and celebration. So while we're here to talk to you today about gun violence in all of its forms, we are working in the context in a state where our lawmakers need to be told to pay attention. We have to tell our lawmakers, don't look away from our crisis of gun violence. It's time to do your jobs. And so with that in mind, we want to talk about briefly, so we've talked a little bit about who we are. We're a nonpartisan grassroots movement working to reduce gun violence in all of its forms. We're strategic. We work in multi ways on the problems of gun violence, combating it at the state and local levels, but also at the federal level, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today. Here in Missouri, Moms Demand Action has local groups all across the state. We have local groups that coordinate. We have monthly events and meetings, but we're going to talk a little bit less about what we do locally today or in Missouri. But those of you who've heard us talk before know that we are part of Every Town for Gun Safety, along with Students Demand Action and the Survivor Network, as Alice mentioned in the introduction. We always like to remind folks that you do not have to be a mom to demand action. We were founded around the concept of motherhood and the protection of our nation's children, but we know it's going to take all of us to make the changes necessary. So parenthood status is irrelevant. We just always have to touch on that. I also want to quickly mention, we like to celebrate some of the accomplishments that this movement's seen in the years since it was founded after Sandy Hook. I want to just call attention to the White House item on this slide, because this is relevant to our talk today, but also for us here in Columbia. The White House just last year, the Biden-Harris administration launched the first ever White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And what's of interest also is that this office is being led by survivors. And one of them, in fact, is a former head of Every Town for Gun Safety. So that's really important work that's happening in large part because of all of our supporters, including, I know, many of you on this call. So many of you, I know, are already familiar with the ways that our movement has been working. We're going to talk about gun laws today. We work on local, state, and federal legislation to pass gun laws that we know will save the most lives. We also, another thing to point out from this sort of overall slide, because we're going to circle back to this, is we work to elect gun sense candidates. So the gun sense candidate program was started in 2018 for candidates who are willing to make gun safety a campaign priority. In 2024, as you can imagine, this is an incredibly important election cycle. And so Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action, we are working not only to support gun sense candidates at the top of the ticket with the Biden-Harris ticket, but also gun sense candidates at the state and local levels. And we're going to talk about a little bit about that as well. So Katie, I'm just going to jump in and talk about federal priorities. Does that sound good?
Yeah. I was just going to add one thing. If anyone is looking for sort of some top line information, Kristin talked about the parade. One thing that you hear often is that more guns make us safer. And the shooting at the parade was just proof positive that that is not true. So schools were canceled in Kansas City for families to take their children to the parade. There were over 600 police officers at the parade and over 200 private security. So the chiefs had private security, the governor had private security, both of Kansas and Missouri. And the fact is that a shooting took place anyway. So if anyone ever tells you that more guns make us safer, you can say it did not make the parade safe. All those parents took their children to a shooting.
Ugh. It's definitely still on my mind. So let's talk about the federal priorities for this movement. Because that's our topic today. We're working to pass common sense gun safety laws at the national level when we're not in Missouri working on focusing on our very weak state laws. So to do that, we support agencies and the people who are working to enforce and implement gun safety laws that we already have, while building support in Congress to pass more common sense gun laws in the future. This is especially critical given that this is an election year. It's also paramount to showing our political power as a movement and our influence. So even before Moms Demand Action volunteers head out to knock doors and hit the phones, we really do have an opportunity to show elected officials and demonstrate that the overwhelming support that Americans have for enacting gun violence prevention policies. So I want to, before we dig in, just give some context. So for those of you who don't maybe follow this super closely, in 2022, we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. The Biden-Harris administration really took historic, huge steps toward advancing gun safety. And we are working still to support their efforts at every turn. So it's critical that we continue to build on that success, keep the pressure up, and demand more than thoughts and prayers from our lawmakers. So today, we're going to talk with you about some efforts that have been happening on the federal level. And number one, we were invited to speak to you all about the meaning, what's important about what the Surgeon General recently released in his report. So let's start there. For the first time ever, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, has issued a Surgeon General's advisory on firearm violence, declaring firearm violence in America to be a public health crisis. This is a critical step forward for safer communities because never before in our country's history has the top doctor for our nation urged that gun violence be treated as what it is, a public health crisis. And so that's exactly what his advisory calls for. He's articulating clear, actionable steps that can be taken today to save lives. These include things from closing loopholes in our background check laws, requiring safe and secure storage of firearms, and investing in community violence intervention programs, to name just a few. So when this announcement came out just recently, it reinforced what we in Moms Demand have known for a very long time, that gun violence is a public safety and a public health crisis. It's, as Katie pointed out, the #1 cause of death for children and teenagers in the United States. And 120 lives are lost every single day. So this is something that demands attention from all of us. I'm going to drop a link to.
I did it, Kristin.
Oh, you did? Yay, thank you.
Advisories, yeah.
I can't see it always from when I'm sharing the slides. Thank you. So let's just back up a second. What is a Surgeon General advisory? Very simply, they are public statements that call attention to an urgent public health crisis or public health issue, and they provide recommendations on that issue and how it should be addressed. So these advisories also, it's good to note, are reserved for very significant public health challenges that require our nation's immediate attention, awareness, and action. So in his advisory, Surgeon General Murthy outlined a public health approach that was, and I'm quoting here, designed to prevent and reduce harm by challenging the conditions and circumstances that contribute to firearm violence, as well as the reverberating or echoing mental health and emotional impacts of that violence. This approach, among other things, includes critical research investments to improve the data that we have, the sources and the collection, and to expand research further and to evaluate the prevention strategies that are out there right now. Another thing it includes is community risk reduction and education prevention strategies that can help us implement community violence interventions, encourage health systems to facilitate education around secure storage. One thing that we know in Moms is something that we didn't talk about in our many multifaceted aspects of this work, but education is so important on secure storage and is one way that we can all take action regardless of who's in office. So the Surgeon General addressed that as well. He's also addressing structural determinants of things that increase firearm violence, and that includes everything from including housing, education, healthcare, and employment and economic opportunities. Another point that I'm going to hit on a couple more points that he raised, firearm risk reduction prevention strategies, such as secure storage, background checks, extreme risk laws, and bans on assault weapons and large capacity magazines. Those are positions that he took in his report that are all across the board things that we've been arguing for years. And finally, mental health care access, he touched on. He wants to see support to increase access to affordable, high quality mental health care and other trauma-informed resources, and to enhance safety measures and mental health resources specifically for our kids, for children and adolescents. So that's a lot. There's a lot in this report. Some of these things echo what was covered and touched on in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022. So it's just another example. Again, the Biden-Harris administration demonstrating that they are committed to listening to advocates and survivors, putting safety first, and making gun violence prevention a priority of this administration. So we in our movement are incredibly grateful for this leadership in the fight to end gun violence. So it's so exciting that we get a chance to sort of share a little bit about this here, because we know that supporting these evidence-based policy recommendations and legislative solutions, those two things can save lives. Evidence shows this. So we want to see investment in community violence prevention programs and mental health resources from, coming from the Surgeon General. This is particularly germane here in Columbia, where we've been having this conversation locally as well. We want to see messaging from the Surgeon General. We welcome this encouragement that promotes secure and responsible gun ownership. Secure storage of firearms is so important in a state like Missouri, where we do live in a culture of gun ownership, and we want to foster more responsible gun ownership. So these are all things that we've been advocating for day in and day out. And the other piece of this that's worth noting is that we really hope that our lawmakers across all levels of government are listening to the Surgeon General and take action to support his messaging and to enact and build from some of these policies to prevent further gun violence. So Katie's dropped a link to the announcement itself on this historic report from the Surgeon General. I didn't remember to ask before we got started of our moderator if we want to stop to answer any questions as we go, or if we can just pivot and move on to the other federal level effort that we're going to talk about today, and pivot to talk about the Supreme Court. Katie, are there any questions in the chat or anything we should pause to do here before we move on?
I don't see any questions in the chat about Mom's work. The only other thing I would add quickly about the Surgeon General's report is that many of you know that the CDC has been barred from studying gun violence as a public health issue. That was one of the things that the gun lobby went to work early on, preventing. There's a law that prevents the CDC from looking at it as a health crisis. So that's why it gives added value to the Surgeon General's report. And Kathy, you've got a question?
Yes, I was wondering if I missed it. Did you talk about gun suicides and the number of those across the country and in Missouri?
We didn't, but I would be happy to address that. So in general, across the country, of the 120 gun deaths every day, 2/3 tend to be suicides and 1/3 are homicides. I would say that homicides disproportionately affect our African-American communities in general, and that the suicides impact more white families. And rural, it tends to be. In Missouri, that's a little bit skewed. Our numbers are almost 50-50. Again, I mentioned the two large urban areas where there are more homicides. That brings, in a scary way, brings our homicide numbers up. But yes, the suicide is gun violence. There are statistics. If a gun is involved, suicide attempts are 95% likely to be effective, whereas if any other method is used, pills, ropes, things like that, those tend to fail. So that's another reason we just talk so much about safe storage, and we can get to this at the end as well. But one of the things we do as moms is present at health fairs, family fests for the city, and we talk to people about safe storage. We've got a whole education program about being smart. And one thing that Kristin and I have seen firsthand again and again, year after year, is people don't realize that other people have unsecured guns in their homes. I've had parents say they didn't realize their grandparents had shotguns under the bed. People send children on play dates not knowing if people have guns in the home. So we try to talk about all of those things. We role play about asking, you're going to send your child on a play date. We role play about asking in a way that's not offensive if there are guns in the home. And what I would say is that people just don't think about it. You know, it's a way of life in rural communities, for example, if you live on a farm, to have a weapon. And people just forget that children can access those, and that people who might be having a crisis. One thing about suicide attempts, and I'm not a psychologist, but very often someone who for some reason wants to kill themselves today might not feel that way tomorrow. And so, but having easy access to a weapon can change that dynamic. So that's another heartbreaking reason that we try to work as hard as we do about promoting the message of safe storage. Thank you, Kathy, for asking the question. Alice.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Talk a little bit about how it has tied our hands and how long that's been that CDC has been banned from doing research, giving out grants. I don't remember if it was which administration did that, but doesn't that leave the data collection mostly just to universities, or of course every town probably trying to do some stuff? That's always really frustrated me as a person from public health.
Right. I know we have a lot of folks in this university town who are committed to evidence-based approaches to public health issues. I think that one of the things that we have seen is definitely during the Biden administration that change was made. So I will get back to you about when exactly that happened, but the restrictions are no longer in place. And what we're seeing,
okay.
yeah. So what we're seeing is the Biden administration committing more resources, pushing ahead to fund research and naming it as something that's needed. I mean, it's interesting, even here in Missouri, there was a bill the governor just signed, I believe it was this week, allocating resources to veteran suicide prevention, and that they don't single out firearm suicide in the bill, but they managed to get a bill over the finish line that is requiring state agencies to fund and look at causes and possible prevention for suicide among veterans, which is astronomically higher than the general population and overwhelmingly impacts our rural communities. So we're seeing a gradual move toward doing more and accepting more research, but it's very recent.
Right. And Alice, it was in the late 90s. It was Bush 2. And
I thought
what they did is Bush and the NRA and Republican allies in Congress blocked federal funding for firearms research, arguing that such study would undermine the constitutional rights of legal gun owners.
Jesus. Just a follow-up question. Parsons vetoed a bill about having electronic stuff in schools in Missouri, some funding for that. I know that Kristin may have certain opinions of that's not going to solve our problems, but at the same time, would we want that re-looking at that bill part of the veto session, for instance, that we think we'll have in September?
That's a good question. I don't have the bill number, Alice. Maybe we can talk about this more later, but you know, the governor did take away some funding that was meant to help secure schools, and it's a confusing, you know, one step forward, one step back. There was also some very minor legislation passed this session that would expand the categories for what kinds of schools qualify to have no firearms in them. Anyway, I don't want to get too far into the weeds today because I
okay, thank you.
Can't predict. Oh no, I have a comment in the chat that I'm seeing from Dave about not feeling super sanguine about the veterans bill, and I agree. I mean, I don't want to overplay the significance of that at all. I just was interested in the context of the question about funding research and looking at best practices. It's definitely being positioned as an opportunity. So anyway, let's move on. I want to allow enough time for all of our topics today. I want to talk next about a really important decision, especially here for us in Missouri, the life-saving decision that was handed down, United States v. Rahimi, where the United States Supreme Court reversed an extremely deadly decision from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that had struck down the long-standing federal law that prohibits domestic abusers who are subject to protective orders from possessing guns. So what happened? In February of 2023, a 3-judge panel on the federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the federal prohibition on gun possession for people subject to domestic violence restraining orders was unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. So in that time, the opinion affected only 3 states. It was Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. But the decision was viewed at the time as extremely dangerous. It stood out as an opportunity to really gut our fundamental public safety laws and endanger the lives of countless domestic violence survivors across the country. So the Supreme Court's decision to reverse the Fifth Circuit's extreme ruling is really a major, major victory for gun safety in the courts. So what was at stake what was at stake is access to a gun. These are some more data we're going to throw at you today. Access to a gun makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will die at the hands of an abuser. If the Supreme Court had affirmed the Fifth Circuit's decision, the federal law that was prohibiting domestic abusers from gaining access to firearms would have been overturned nationwide. It would have meant that the country, across the country, domestic abusers under restraining orders would have been able to legally access firearms with, as we can imagine, deadly consequences. It's our position that the gun laws that protect victims of domestic abuse are common sense, and that also we know that they have a long history of bipartisan support. They're among some of the most important public safety laws in the country. People with dangerous, abusive, and violent histories shouldn't have access to a deadly weapon. This is something, I don't mean to be snarky, but I feel like it's common sense. This is one of those things that we talk about, common sense gun safety laws. Make no mistake, we should not have been here in this case in the first place. Recognizing that the survivors of domestic violence should be protected from gun violence is the bare minimum that we should be able to expect from our court system. So Moms Demand Action volunteers, Students Demand Action volunteers, alongside many, many survivors of gun violence, we've been making our voices clear and speaking out against that Fifth Circuit Court decision, including having a rally at the Supreme Court back in November. Ultimately, we made our demands for the protection of families and women known, and we are celebrating this very significant victory now in the light of that fight to protect our families. So we know that many, many millions of domestic violence survivors can rest easier with this decision, but it's really important to note here in Missouri, there is much more work that needs to be done. Laws that prohibit domestic abusers from having easy access to guns need to be robustly implemented. And we also need to be voting for lawmakers who will prioritize the safety of women and children. Here in Missouri, as you may know, we do not have a state statute matching federal law protecting domestic abuse victims. And it's worth remembering, as we think ahead to the fall, who put us in this jeopardy in the first place. Of the 3 extreme judges on the Fifth Circuit who sided with the abuser, Rahimi, who wanted to keep his guns, 2 of those were appointed by President Trump. So while common sense, we can see triumphed in this case, 4 more years of a Trump presidency will put more innocent lives on the line. We can see that now. And I know for me, I'm definitely voting on this issue and keeping this front of mind as I vote in November. The other thing I just want to step back, if I have a minute, to talk about is how does this issue of domestic violence, Katie mentioned it at the beginning, how does it matter more broadly? Since the Boone decision in 2022, we have seen extremists in the gun lobby move to take their work to the courts to contest more and more common sense safety laws. The future that they are looking for is one with guns everywhere for anyone, no questions asked, no matter how deadly the impact. But we know that domestic violence and gun violence are inextricably linked. Every month in this country, 70 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. And the presence of a gun, as I mentioned, makes a woman 5 times more likely to be killed at the hands of her abuser. So we also know that this burden is disproportionately borne by women of color. They bear the brunt of this. Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic women are victims of homicide at the highest rates, and more often than not, it's at the hand of a domestic abuser. Last thing I want to point out, look, research also shows that domestic violence, that there is an outsized connection between mass shootings and domestic violence. In nearly half of the mass shootings with 4 or more people being killed in America, the perpetrator shoots an intimate partner or family member as part of that rampage. So these issues are linked. So the bottom line here, even though we're talking about the Supreme Court, SCOTUS, is that elections have consequences, right? Like who we elect to office is going to determine whether or not common sense gun safety laws and judges, what will stand. So we are in Moms Demand really devoted to this idea that we need to activate our communities to only be electing leaders who will stand up against extremist judges like the ones that we mentioned in this case. So there has been some new work from Everytown about what needs to happen in states now that Rahimi has been decided in states to ensure that there's effective implementation of the existing laws. But as I mentioned, in Missouri, we have no such matching statute. So this is something that we will be working in Missouri. We're talking today about federal efforts, but we have been focused year in and year out on domestic violence legislation at the state level, and is something we will continue going forward. So I see there's some questions in the chat. Katie, do we have questions on the topic that we want to address now, or should we keep going?
I'm answering Kathy. I think we're good. It's mostly me posting some of the documents, and then there's one thing I want to talk about at the end and sort of follow up on.
Okay, so we want to pivot to elections work, because we know that we have a chance to make a change on this issue if we elect more gun sense candidates. The Rahimi decision, this is why elections matter. So because we have a chance to directly impact who sits on these benches and on these courts. So everything we've been discussing so far at the federal level, all of that progress that we are seeing from the Biden-Harris administration, it brings us back to elections. So I want to talk a little bit here about what we're doing as a chapter to ensure that we elect more gun sense champions this fall. I work on the statewide elections team for our chapter, and we started with our meeting strategizing last summer, meeting with volunteers across the state to figure out our focus, our priorities. We've come up with a list of around 20 critical races across the state that we think will be crucial in changing the dynamics in Jefferson City. So just to really quickly, if you haven't heard of this before, we have a program called Gun Sense Candidates. It's a program that's reflecting the fact that gun safety is a winning issue at every level, up and down the ballot. So in the past few election cycles, you've probably, if you've been on these calls with me before, you've heard me talk about, we have worked to select gun sense candidates up and down the ballot, from school boards to state houses to the White House. And there's even more at stake, as we all know, in 2024. So that's why we are organizing our 10 million supporters nationally and our many thousands of supporters across Missouri to just take one election action minimum this cycle. We want everybody aware that we have a chance to make a change in Jefferson City. So gun sense candidates are meant to tell our supporters where candidates are on this issue, if they will govern with gun safety in mind. Those who get the distinction, they fill out a survey. If they are awarded the distinction, they are going to advocate for safer communities if they're elected. Multiple candidates can receive the distinction in any given race. It's nonpartisan, so it's open to everyone. The program this year is open to candidates running for election for municipal and law enforcement races, state legislature, attorney general, state treasurer, secretary of state, lieutenant governor, and then of course the federal offices. So I just want to put this URL on your radar. This is where to go to find the candidates who have already received the distinction in Missouri. You can use this drop-down set of menus to find all of the candidates on the ballot who've already sought this distinction. It's not over. We're still receiving and sort of following up with candidates to make sure that everyone who should answer this survey has answered this survey. Katie, can you drop that Gun Sense voter link in the chat?
Yes.
That's great. I know we've talked a little bit about Missouri and our state legislature. And our work locally, we don't have a ton of time to get into a recap, but I just did want to sort of press back on this idea that so much of our strategy in Missouri, like until we get more people in Jefferson City breaking the supermajority's hold on this issue, we will not see improvement to our safety laws. This year, as we have for many, many years, going back to when I first started volunteering, we have seen extremist legislation that attempted to force guns on public transportation, in churches, to expand the ability for people to shoot first and think later, to expand the number of people who can carry guns in our schools. All of those bills were defeated, so that's a win. If you took an action with us this legislative session, I just want to say thank you. You helped. Things that did not advance, unfortunately, as we've mentioned, domestic violence legislation has still not been heard for years in the legislature. And the attempt by many Democrats working together after the parade to repeal preemption law that would allow local cities and localities to pass their own gun safety restrictions was met with nothing, was soundly ignored by leadership. So until we get more, until we break that supermajority, we won't see change there. So I missed if somebody was asking a question. Katie, did I miss a hand raise?
Yes. So, well, you want to finish up and then there's some questions in the chat.
Okay, great. I just want to give us, we have one thing that we want to ask you all to do with us today.
Missouri, see how it works.
So one of the things we want to talk really briefly about is an attack that's happening on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act work and the ATF in particular. We've been talking on the federal level, so our call to action today is going to be a federal one again. So we have a number of ways to get involved. I want to explain really quickly this is a mouthful, the engaged in the business rule. Here's the deal. For decades, we've seen that unlicensed gun sellers have sold guns at gun shows and online without conducting background checks. If you have friends who are gun owners, many of them may assume, well, I did a background check, so everyone does. That is not the case. But that's because under federal law, only licensed gun dealers are required to conduct background checks. It's a serious problem. It means more guns are getting into the wrong hands and it's creating more gun violence in our communities. So our movement has been working to close this loophole, from working to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act to driving thousands of comments on the rules when they were up for public comment, to make sure that no community has to deal with this overwhelming issue of no background check sales. Okay, so, and it worked. So because of the advocacy of our movement, the ATF did finalize a rule that would require more unlicensed gun sellers to become licensed dealers. And in turn, it requires them to run background checks. But what's happening now is extremists in Congress are trying to repeal this life-saving rule, and we cannot let this happen. This rule has been a game changer. It's increasing public safety. It also gives law enforcement more tools to help prevent and solve crimes. It does this really briefly by making it more difficult for criminals to purchase illegal guns and for gun traffickers to acquire them. So providing law enforcement with tools to prevent those things, this seems like a no-brainer. But this rule is under attack. And the one thing you sometimes might hear about this rule is that it's not lawful. It is a lawful exercise of the authority that Congress has and has long given to the ATF to enforce the laws that Congress has passed, and nothing in this rule violates the Second Amendment. So if you have a phone and the ability to scan a QR code, this on your screen now is a link to our message, our tool to send a message to your member of Congress. Scan the code, it'll pull up the form. We're also going to show it here in a second. That's what it looks like. Basically, we're just asking everyone to tell Congress that the ATF needs to be protected. This rule needs to be protected. The other way to do this, if you don't want to use a QR code, is you can send a text, the word defend, to the phone number 64433. And again, that's what this form looks like. We always have multiple ways to get involved in our movement. I mentioned our phone number 64433. If you want to get involved with moms, if you've been on the sidelines and thinking you'd like to come to a meeting or know more about what we're doing, the way to get involved is to text the word, just send a text with the word ready to that phone number 64433 if you are ready to join this movement. And the next event that we're hosting that I would love, especially the Muleskinners, to have on your radar, our next statewide elections meeting. We've been having these meetings monthly since last July. We're going all the way through November because we are all in on elections. We are continuing these meetings in July on the 29th with a statewide meeting. We host these calls to dig into the work that we're doing to support those critical races that I mentioned. We also do mini trainings, and we talk to people about how to engage their friends in taking election actions. Everybody in Moms is being invited to take just one action. So you're welcome to join us on that call in the end of the month and July 29th. And Katie, this is our last slide, I believe. Are there questions? We want to make sure people know about the best way to interact with us locally. We have a Facebook group, which I know people on this phone call might appreciate joining our Facebook page. And we also are trying to move folks, acknowledging that lots of people hate social media, want to get away from social media. So we also have an app, which is an app created by Moms Demand Action and monitored by us. It's where you find all of our events, including our election events. So if we have door knocking for Adrian Plank, for example, who is one of those critical races that I referred to before, we have to hold his seat. We will be sharing ways to get involved in all of these different events on the app as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I see there's a question from David, maybe?
Yes, my question was for those who don't have smartphones. Is that ATF rule form available via the website or online where we can just fill it out and send it in?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me just grab the link and I'll drop it in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then, Kristin, we've got a couple questions in the chat about whether Drew Carey, our local sheriff, is a Dwayne. Sorry,
Yes.
Dwayne Carey. Yes. And then Ken Schneeberger has a question about how many of the 20 crucial races are close to home.
I want to answer the question about Sheriff Carey first, because I'm excited to say that he is in the pipeline to become a Gun Sense candidate. I did see that he took the survey just recently, so hopefully that will be smooth sailing. The whole process takes a couple of weeks so that the folks at our national offices who look at the questionnaires, give us time to respond. So it'll be announced soon, I hope.
Okay.
Sorry, I missed the second question.
Okay, Ken Schneeberger was asking how many of the 20 critical races are in Boone County?
Well, it's a fluid list. Originally, we had 2 races on that, 2 local races on that list, including governor. So Crystal Quaid, who is a Gun Sense candidate, unfortunately, she has a primary challenger, so we are not supporting events for her yet, but hopefully after the primary. I'm just speaking personally. I'm hopeful that
Yeah.
after the primary we can. The other 2 races are Adrian Planks and Senate District race, where Stephen Weber has not yet completed the Gun Sense candidate survey, but we keep nudging him every chance we get. So hopefully he will be a Gun Sense candidate soon. And those are the 2 races locally that we are focused on.
And I would
Okay.
also just add, and then I've got the Herb and Sue have a question, but I would just add that trying to do something about the supermajority in Jefferson City is a priority. Also, it's just what is allowed to happen with the supermajority in any state is really terrible for democracy. Okay.
So may I interrupt and say that, you know, I although I'm not a priority district, I was flattered to be dubbed a Gun Sense candidate by Moms for Action. So I very much appreciate that.
We were very, oh, look what I did to my screen. I was very excited to be able to announce that to Dave at one of our meetings because he was not aware until he came to our monthly meeting and was participating. But yeah, if you know of other candidates up and down the ballot who should be hearing from us, I'm going to drop my email in the chat. You can find us on our Facebook page, but we want to make sure that candidates up and down the ballot have access to the Gun Sense candidate survey and materials, and that our supporters know where our local candidates stand. So please reach out if you know of other candidates who you're not.
First ward
Okay.
candidate.
And Sue and Herb, you guys have a question?
I had a quick question. I also comment that sometimes the candidates that we really want to get in, maybe in a district such as we've had in the past, that they can't necessarily take certain stands and likely win. And I think, for instance, Claire McCaskill might have been one of those. But the question I had is, some of us are really bothered by the automatic weapons. Do you folks do much of talking about that or lobbying against them, or is that kind of low on your priority list?
Katie, you want to take that one? It's
Yeah,
changed over
sure.
time.
Yeah, no, we do. One thing that I would say about moms, we mentioned the research. So we don't promote anything that we don't know for a fact works. Here, I'll give you an example with the Las Vegas shooter and the bump stocks. You know, people came out right away saying, are you guys against bump stocks? And in theory, we would be, but there wasn't research showing how dangerous they were. There is now, so we are against them. And yes, the assault weapons, we just at Moms, we include all forms of gun violence, and things like that are so incredible to us. Kristin, do you want to add anything about?
Yeah, I will say that the politics of this question have changed over time. And originally, the reason we did not focus on the kind of weapon was that we actually knew from research that handguns are by far and away the weapon of choice in most gun violence that we are fighting. But when we talk about horrific mass shootings, and especially in Missouri, where we know that the number and kinds of weapons in some of our urban communities have really escalated, and we find our police, our law enforcement are outmatched by assault rifles and high capacity magazines, our position changed over time. So it was not maybe a priority a few years ago the way it is now. And I will say that the political cover that the Biden-Harris administration have given on this question has really helped us foreground it. Like, we talk about it 100% more than we used to.
I will make one comment because I had some Canadian relatives visiting. They said if an American went to the border for Canada trying to go in and had an assault weapon with them, not only could they not take the assault weapon in the country, they could not go in the country. they would be stopped at the border.
Yep.
That's how strongly they feel about it, against them.
Yeah. I mean, we are by far and away of advanced nations. We are unique among nations with the kinds and the numbers of weapons. And unfortunately, during the pandemic, firearms sales skyrocketed. So the problem's only gotten worse. And, you know, the pandemic's over, but those guns are still in our communities. So it's really, it's an escalating problem.
Thank you for what you're doing.
And then Kathy Jensen had asked me to speak briefly about something. So I touched on briefly the Be Smart program, where we try to educate people about safe storage. And so SMART is an acronym for securing your weapon, modeling good behavior. So as parents, grandparents, things like that, asking. So if you're sending your children or going on vacation somewhere, asking if people have guns in the home. The R is for recognizing. So, you know, maybe sort of a temporary mental health crisis, somebody who might not do well with a weapon at the house, in the home, could that be changed just for a temporary period of time? And then telling, again, if you see something, if you see a weapon, you see a person, you know something's wrong, telling a grown-up. And we are working hard right now. So we have a whole team on our volunteer base of people who work only on Be Smart. It's our education program. I mentioned we speak at health fairs. We'll talk to anyone who will listen with the Be Smart program. We've got a cute little bee cutout. You can have your kids have a photograph. We have crafts related to bees. And we have a team in particular right now who is working with the Columbia Public School board and system, the Columbia Public School system. We've got a friend in Suzette Waters, who's a former mom's volunteer, and we're actively trying to get information into Peach Jar. So just that's the Friday folder, the equivalent of the Friday folder that's now electronic, getting information into every parent's hands about safe storage. Again, just because the rate of accidents with guns in the home in places they shouldn't be, and people who don't know they're there. So that is getting some traction. It's not as easy as you would think. Kristin has talked several times about common sense. So safe storage seems like common sense. Banning bump stock seems like common sense. Not allowing people accused of domestic violence to have weapons. It all seems like common sense, but it's not really that easy when the rubber hits the road. So we're working on getting it into Peach Jar, and that would be a huge win for us. And if any of you on the call are parts of organizations where we could give a Be Smart presentation, Kristin left her email. We are happy to talk to anyone who will listen about it. So thanks, Kathy, for that.
I had a question I wanted to circle back in the chat. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. So Pam or David, you put in the chat, Valerie Carroll, who's candidate for the first ward. Is that an election that's happening in 2024 or 2025? Okay, so yeah, so I will follow up maybe with the Boone. Is Valerie a Boone Dems member? I can find her contact information at the office.
I don't know if she's a member of the Democratic Party. She did come to our Central Committee meeting last month to introduce herself, though. So
I think I have her contact.
thank you,
If
Pam.
you have it, I would love it. And I, for sure.
Contact Kristin. I have her contact. And also she's having an event on the 13th on Saturday, a public barbecue, trying to join volunteer. She's going to be a great city council person with no opposition. But I'll send you the contact I have for her.
Yeah,
And
we have a lot of people in city council who are already gun sense candidates who won. And we have in Mayor Buffalo a member of Mayors Against Illegal Guns, which is a national coalition of mayors across the country who are supporters. So, oh, thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
I will follow up.
And the fundraiser, I believe, it's in later in the afternoon, I believe, is at the Optimus Park. They're on, well, between Business 70 and where Ridgeway School is.
And she's on the August ballot, so she will be elected very soon.
Right. She's on the August ballot. Yes.
And every election matters.
Yes, absolutely. We need all of our candidates, even up and down the ballot. You know, we've got a lot new categories that are eligible this year. And just so it's clear, like the people running for city council get different questions than the people running for school board and the people running for US Senate. It gives them messaging and questions relevant to the work that they will do in office. And so I haven't talked to Valerie yet, but I will reach out. Thank you for that flag, everyone.
Kristen,
There's a question in chat about, do you have a regularly scheduled local meeting?
We do not have a regularly scheduled meeting. Before the pandemic, we used to, and what we try to do now, Calvary Episcopal Church is very gracious about us holding meetings in their parish hall. We love them. And so when we do have meetings, they're on Thursday evenings. Thursday evenings is also the night that the Community Gun Violence Group meets on Facebook, that's run by Rose Metro. And we also try to have Zoom options for people. So that's a really great plug for downloading the Demand Action app, because we don't hold regular meetings. And to hear about them, you need to be on one of our channels, either the app or social media, to hear about the meetings, but everyone is welcome all the time.
Or our email list.
It seems like you often have meetings on, I guess, the second Thursday of the month, which is when our Democratic Central Committee has meetings. So I can never come since I've been active with the Dems and election stuff. But.
Well, that's good to know, Alice. Thank you for that. And we do try to schedule around things, but if you could hear the reasons people can't come on certain nights, it's always something.
Right.
So anyway, and then Dave, do you have a question for us, or did we?
Yes, well,
the button?
I put it, yeah, the button, and maybe it was answered, I missed it, but yeah, the button she's wearing, it looks Gun Sense Voter, I think it says.
Kristen is the woman with buttons.
Oh, my button? You mean this button?
Does this say Gun Sense Voter?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where can we get buttons like this? Very good. Where can we get some of those?
So we are not shilling for this, but you can buy them on the Moms Demand Action website in the store. But the way I will just say among friends here locally that when we do have in-person events, we have a small amount of swag that we give away to people, and you don't have to be a member. Taking an action with us means you're a mom's supporter. So we bring stuff like this and give it away. So stay tuned if you want to come to an election event where we will be knocking doors. We will be in parades. We have a lot of things coming up that aren't meetings this summer and into the fall. And I don't know how many of these I have in my basement, but I will look for you. But if you're impatient, you can buy them on the Moms Demand Action website.
Thank you very much.
Listen, if you happen to give me a few that I might keep in a drawer at election headquarters, they wouldn't be for the public because you're nonpartisan, or we could give them to people like David here.
Yeah. Well, between you, me, and the lamppost, I also have my own button maker. So this could happen. Who knows what I might do?
All right, I see it's after 1. Do we have other questions for our speakers? Kristin and Katie, thank you very much for being with us again.
This has been wonderful.
Oh, yeah. Thank you guys for welcoming us.
Thank you very much.
It's been wonderful.
Thanks for doing this.
Are you guys going to share your slides with us, or what? Or
We can. Would that be useful? I would be happy to share them. I can
I
drop
think
them.
it'd be useful if I want to share it to my friends that didn't get on today, but I'm working to get them more involved.
If you have a link to your PowerPoint presentation, send it to me and I'll make sure it gets on our website along with the recorded meeting.
Or if you could send just the slides themselves to Alice, she can pass them on, and we can pass those, because some people might just want the slides themselves.
Who do I email? I'm sorry, I was looking at the slides and I missed who.
I think to email it to Dave.
I'll chat to.
To Dave Taylor, not Dave.
He'll put an email in the chat, he says.
A lot of Daves.
Right. Dave Taylor, yeah, the man. He said he'll put his email in the chat so you have something to send to.
I'll do it right now.
I was going to ask that too. I like the slides as well.
Yeah, we have a lot of, we went through a lot of information, and everything we said is in the speaker's notes. So if you want to go back and see what we were talking about, it's all in there.
Great. Well, thank you again. All right.
You can always look at the recording of this meeting where it's all here.
And we can
Right.
pause it. Yep.
I'm going to be sending the meeting for what it's worth to the Tribune reporters and see if I can get some interest. They have in the past sometimes taken a recording and done an article on it. Never hurts to try.
All right. Well, thank you again for both of you for speaking for us. It was fascinating. I always love to hear from moms. In fact, I've already got I found on the website where to get one of those t-shirts. So I've got that up on the screen. So